You've heard the claim, the Bible is full of contradictions. But is that actually true? I mean, if God is perfect, skeptics say, his word must have zero conflicts, and since they think they've found a few, well, they dismiss the entire faith. But here's the problem. Most of these so-called contradictions reveal more about how modern readers misinterpret ancient writings, not that the Bible is wrong. Hi, everyone. I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this episode, we'll take a deep dive into the challenge that skeptics level against the Bible, that it contradicts either itself, science, or some other aspect of human knowledge. We'll break down the top claims and show how logic, language, and the historical context quickly collapse them. Now, if you've ever felt pressured by skeptical friends online or wondered how to answer objections confidently, well, stick around. Your confidence in scriptures is about to grow stronger than ever. See, the Bible can handle the heat. That's all coming up on this. Come, let us reason together. Well, welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together. Today I bring you a talk that I gave a couple of years ago during the COVID era when we were all locked down. Instead of stopping our teaching, what we did was we offered several live streams of different topics in a series called Christianity in the Hot Seat. Now, those aren't available to the general public right now. They are available if you become a defender and support Come Reason Ministries with a monthly gift. But today I will bring you one of those talks, Contradictions and the Bible, dealing with that aspect of how to understand the skeptics' charge of biblical contradictions, how to unpack what they mean, and the best ways to approach those who would offer these so-called objections and how we can understand them in a more appropriate and positive context. It's a little bit of a different kind of approach as we have slides and interaction going on during the stream, but I think it's something that you'll find engaging as well as informative. So without further ado, here we go dealing with contradictions in the Bible. I hope you've been enjoying this series. We've really covered quite a lot of ground, even though we've only had, say, 3 or 4 classes, but lots of interesting topics so far and more on the way, as you can imagine. So I'm just excited to go through so many of these different issues and different questions that people ask as they continue on. There's been a lot of struggles, obviously, that folks have had. And as we, again, live in a post-Christian culture, there's just a lot of misunderstandings. People don't know the basic elements of what the Bible teaches, how it represents people, and they hear a lot of nonsense, should I say, online and things like that. And so today we're going to be kind of tackling one of those issues. It is, what about all the contradictions in the Bible? And this is something, of course, that again you hear a lot about offered in many different times. But I think it's a really important idea, something that really needs to be addressed and sometimes is taken too much for granted by both sides, really, as we start to talk about things. So first of all, it's really easy, like I said, to misunderstand different aspects of the biblical stories. Matter of fact, I remember hearing some bloopers that had come out from Sunday school kids, and these are different teachers who have recorded different things that kids either misheard or misunderstood about the Bible, and both from either Christian classes or Jewish classes. Some of the kids said, in the first book of the Bible, Gineas, God got tired of creating the world, so he took the Sabbath off. That was their understanding. Or Adam and Eve were created from an apple tree, one young child thought. Noah's wife was called Joan of Arc, which would make sense, I think. Of course, Noah built the ark, and all the animals came in on pairs, P-E-A-R-S, yeah. I like this one. Lot's wife was a pillar of salt by day, but a ball of fire by night. I don't even want to ask on that. The Jews were a proud people, and throughout history they had trouble with unsympathetic genitals, is what one child told us. Yeah, that's not quite correct. Another one said Moses led the Hebrews to the Red Sea, where they made unleavened bread, which is bread made without any ingredients. The fifth commandment, humor thy mother and father. That may be true. The seventh commandment, thou shalt not admit adultery. Not quite, yeah. Moses died before he ever reached the UK. Then Joshua led the Hebrews in the Battle of Jericho. There you go. Yeah, fighting the long battle. Solomon, one of David's sons, had 300 wives and 700 porcupines. Okay, I can see that. This is obviously somebody from a Brooklyn church. When the three wise guys from the east side arrived, they found Jesus and the manager. Not quite, yeah. Jesus enunciated the golden rule, which was to say to do one to others before they do one to you. Oh my gosh, I hope not. He also explained that man doth not live by sweat alone. I like this one. Somebody explained that the epistles were the wives of the apostles. Okay. And one of the opossums was St. Matthew, who was by profession a taxi man. Yeah. And then the last one, a Christian should have only one wife, and that is called monotony. Well, those are some claims. Of course, they're mostly in fun, but again, people don't understand about these kinds of things. So my question really is, what is the big deal in all of this? Why do we talk about these things like Bible contradictions? What makes them something that intrigues people, something that sparks conversation? Well, there's some ideas that if the Bible is truly the Word of God, then it would contain no contradictions. God wouldn't contradict himself, right? God, being all-knowing, would know what a contradiction is, and he shouldn't say things like that. But their argument goes, the Bible contains contradictions. Therefore, the Bible cannot be truly the Word of God. So you've put your faith in something that you shouldn't put your faith in, Christian. That's the argument that the skeptic will offer, and that's what we wanted to tackle today. Now, let me just say one thing before we get started too deeply in this, and that is, when you're discussing things like this, one of the points I always make is it's very important not to bluff, not to just say, I've heard folks say before, well, if anybody ever tells you the Bible's full of contradictions, then hand them a Bible and say, show me some. And you might get away with that, but that's a terrible strategy, because what if they turn to a page and say, yeah, right here, answer this? Then what do? You see, bluffing is a good strategy for poker. It's a terrible strategy for witnessing. So we need to know what we're talking about when we talk about contradiction claims and things like that. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to tackle this subject, because actually what you'll find is many of these claims, no matter what the specific claim is, many of these claims can be identified as probably not being a contradiction at all. It just comes down to understanding the mistakes that people make and how they misunderstand contradiction from maybe a problem in the text, or maybe a difficult text reading, or maybe a piece of knowledge that we don't yet know. And so there's differences in that, and that's one of the kinds of things that I want to highlight in our class today. So, for example, let's just take a minute, and if you've ever taken a critical thinking course or logic class, this will be something that's familiar to you. But still, if you've not, it's just important. What do we mean when we say something is a contradiction? What is a contradiction? Because a contradiction is a very specific thing. And we have to be careful that we don't overstate the concept of a contradiction. So, in logic, you have three primary laws, right? The laws of logic the first is the law of identity. A equals A. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you have a thing, say you have the sun, and you have a list of attributes, a star in the Milky Way galaxy that is orbited by at least 8 planets, the third planet of which we know has life. Okay, there's a list of attributes. And those attributes are the exact same as the sun, then we're talking about the same thing. So if I'm talking about the star that the Earth orbits, and I'm talking about the sun, I'm talking about the same thing. Those are A equals A. All of the attributes of the sun are the same as the attributes of a star the Earth orbits. There's nothing that's different between the two of them. So that's just the law of identity. That's kind of self-understanding that you can use different words. You can say the Big Apple, or you can say New York City. The list of attributes for the Big Apple and the list of attributes for New York City would be exactly the same. We're talking about the same thing. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. Law of identity. The second law in logic is the law of non-contradiction, and that says that A cannot be non-A at the same time and in the same way. So what do I mean by that? Well, if I'm talking about the sun, and I'm talking about the sun as a red star, something that's grown bigger and growing cold, you would say, well, wait a minute, that's not the sun. Our sun isn't a red star, it's a yellow star, for example. Or if I'm talking about New York City, and I'm talking about a city that's landlocked, you would say, wait a minute, that's not New York City, because a landlocked city, that's not a defining feature of New York at all. New York has, right? It sits on the ocean. New York City has beaches. It has shoreline. So it can't be a landlocked city and still be New York City. If there's one thing in there that proves that doesn't match with all of the attributes of that thing at the same time or in the same way, then it's not. Now, I could say, the sun will be a red star in, 30 billion years or something like that. And now I'm not talking about the same time, I'm talking about the future. The sun is a yellow star now, but it will be a red star. So when I talk about the sun as a red star, and I'm putting it in a different point in time, that's not a contradiction. That's something that's saying, hey, it will happen. Or if I'm not meaning it in the same way, if I tell someone that, well, I'm here in my home, but really I'm in Hawaii right now. I don't mean it that I'm physically in Hawaii. When I say I'm in Hawaii, maybe I mean I'm daydreaming that I'm in Hawaii. My mind is in Hawaii. People say this all the time. Are you with us right now? Right? They ask that question. Are you with us right now? Well, they don't mean physically. They mean is your mental awareness here versus someplace else. And that's the idea of not being in the same manner or the same way. So, and then the third law of the law of excluded middle, you have to be either A or not. A thing it either has to be New York or it's not New York, right? It's one or the other. So either New York is a landlocked city or it is not a landlocked city. It can't be both at the same time. And that's the law of excluded middle. And what a contradiction is then formally, it means that you are offering two claims that are like saying New York is a landlocked city, but it's not a landlocked city. And that butts heads. So a man is either married or he's a bachelor. You can't be a married bachelor, right? A married bachelor is a contradictory term. It doesn't make any sense. There's no such thing as a married bachelor. There's no such thing as a square circle. Jesus is either God or he's not God. He can't be both. He can't be God for you and not God for me if we mean it, ontologically, if we mean his actual existence as a being. So this is what we see in this. And then what follows from that is the law of rational inference, which basically says that we use these laws of logic to make arguments, right? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore we know Socrates is mortal. But that's not the big point. The big point is understanding that a contradiction is holding to two different concepts or stating two different concepts and saying both are true. It is true that Joe is married, and it is also true that Joe is a bachelor. You just can't do that's a contradictory claim, a married bachelor or a square circle. Those things just don't exist. So what we want to do now is look at really what people mean when they claim that the Bible holds contradictions. What are the errors that come out when people make claims that the Bible itself is contradictory? And we're going to look at three different specific types of errors. I think most claims of contradiction that you'll find either online on the internet or through those that you discuss with generally, or even those in book form, fall into one of these kind of categories. And the categories are briefly robot reporting. They expect robot reporting. They either snub style to force meaning, or they take a my way or the highway approach to the text. And I want to explain each one of those. So let's start with the first one, and that is expecting robot reporting. And this is a big deal that I think we fall into or hear a lot about. And a lot of it is due to a little bit of the bias that we have in our modern culture. We time things. We are very, very detailed. You know, our science and our mechanics and our technology has allowed us to become very, very precise in this world. So we time things down to the second, sometimes down to the millisecond. If you're on a diet, you weigh things to the gram. If you're, scheduling a Zoom call, right? 7 o'clock sharp. And all of these things are very, very precise. And people in ancient times didn't hold that level of precision because, first of all, they didn't have the tools. But beyond that, it really didn't make that much difference. I mean, the sun rose, the sun set. With the Roman system, you had the kind of 3-hour time periods, the morning, noon, evening, night watches, things like that, where you would divide up the day into 4 quadrants, and then you could divide them up into sub-quadrants of that. But they were just very roundabout numbers because that was really all that people needed to get by. Well, similarly, when they would record events, they would record the major aspects of events. And what we find most people today expect is what I call robot reporting. And that's just simply not what happens. So let me go through a couple of things. First of all, one of the things that they would expect is what I would call strict court transcript style reporting of the words of the speakers. Every single word that individual says, that has to be put down. And if they said any words at all of those words should be included. So, for example, we know that this isn't true with the Gospels, right? Because we know that Jesus primarily spoke in Aramaic as he was teaching. Matter of fact, many times the Gospels will translate. John will say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which translated means, right? So he's saying Jesus is speaking in Arabic, and then he translates it for his reading. John's writing in Greek. Greek was the common language that all people would understand. Yet Jesus was probably teaching in Aramaic, and those teachings were then translated by the apostles. Similarly, the Old Testament was put down in Hebrew, and as it was recorded in Hebrew, then you had the Babylonian captivity, people came back, Greek became the dominant language of the ancient world, yet their scriptures were still in Hebrew. Well, this caused a lot of problems because people couldn't remember the Hebrew scriptures. Nobody spoke Hebrew anymore. A lot of them spoke Greek. So starting about 250 BC, a group of 70 scholars or so got together and they started translating the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. This became known as the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. Septuagint just meaning 70. And when the apostles quote from the Old Testament, many times they're quoting from the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which is why when you read quotations from the New Testament, they don't quite match up. So this is one of the ideas that I mean when I talk about strict court transcript style reporting of the words of the speakers. They didn't do that. They wanted you to get the understanding and the general idea of what was being said. The ideas were important, and they wanted to make sure that those ideas were translated clearly, but it may not have been exactly word for word as it's recorded in the text. They just didn't see a need to be that narrow with their recordings. That doesn't mean that the New Testament isn't inspired. That's a different question, right? So the New Testament can be inspired by the word choices of the New Testament authors, but when they quote the Old Testament, they're not contradicting the Old Testament because they're using different words. That's not a contradiction. That's using a different translation and making an inference from that translation. So that's one of the ideas, that court transcript, that Jesus may have said many things, but only the high points would be something that the apostles wrote down, right? So in Mark's gospel, for example, we would understand that very many of those events are actually Peter's sermons as he was teaching and remembering Jesus' sermons. So Peter was recounting Jesus' sermons, and he's just giving you the high points. He's not talking about absolutely every thing that Jesus ever said. Matter of fact, John tells us that there wouldn't be enough books to contain all the miracles that Jesus did or all the things that he did. So we know it's a summation. We know it's not a detail by detail, blow by blow. Okay, secondly, robot reporting, absolute precision of description. So what do I mean by this? Well, again, this is part of what we understand, but maybe it's not so important in old days. So if we say, he had maybe 13,000 men, that's a round number, right? It may be 12,732 or something like that when you count them all up. But round numbers worked. That's all they had to worry about. It got the idea across. It wasn't necessary to get into because it really didn't make a difference to those folks. They just wanted to give you the idea that there was a big crowd, right? Things like that. So that's the idea with absolute precision. You would use round numbers like that, and that would be considered perfectly fine for historical use, for historians to do that in that point. Exhaustive information. So the other thing that a lot of folks challenge people on in the Bible today is they ask about stuff that's not there. Well, what about this? Cain took a wife and married her. Well, where did she come from? Well, yeah, it doesn't say. It says Adam and Eve had Abel, had Cain, had Seth, and had other children as well. So Cain married one of his near relatives, more likely. That's what we seek to understand. It doesn't talk about dinosaurs in the Bible, per se. Does that mean that the Bible says there were no dinosaurs? No, it just doesn't mention them because they weren't germane. It doesn't mention a lot of things. It doesn't mention kangaroos either. It wasn't necessary because the Bible isn't trying to give you a zoological classification of everything. It's just trying to talk about the important stories that are relevant to themselves. And that's part of the thing. So it's not exhaustive in that aspect. And like I said, John says that the world couldn't contain the books that would be written of everything else that would happen. The other thing that is important in recognizing a problem, and this sometimes looks more like a contradiction than not, and that is expecting there to be no errors from, say, copyists. So this is a big important point. We don't have the original manuscripts from any of the books of either the New or the Old Testament. We don't have the ones that the actual authors wrote. We do have, and I made this point clearly in my talk 3-4 weeks ago, which is on the YouTube channel. You can take a look at it. We do have copies though, and those copies are highly reliable. So much so that we can understand that we have well over 99% of the original manuscript data we are absolutely confident are in our Bibles today. We just have looked at that. I don't want to take the time to go into that. You can go back and watch the video that we did at the beginning of this series to research that. But that doesn't mean that as people were copying it down, that they didn't make mistakes or get things wrong. So, for example, here's an example. The Wicked Bible. How many of you have heard of the Wicked Bible? Right? This was a Bible that was published in 1611. It was actually a few years after that. It's one of the King James Bibles that somebody started printing. And there was an interesting piece in this Bible because there was a misprint. And the misprint came in Exodus 20:14. And there you see it right there. It says, "Thou shalt commit adultery." So of course, this was a top seller as people were going to get their new Bible. Again, obviously, it's clear that was a mistake that the copyists made. But that doesn't mean that we should the commandment has been changed now. That's not a contradiction in the Bible. That's a flaw in copying the text. And we see this other places as well. So for example, for 2 Chronicles 9:25 tells us that Solomon had 4,000 horses. Okay. But 1 Kings 4:26, talking about the same time, same events, reports that Solomon had 40,000 horses. Well, which is it? Contradiction. Did Solomon have 4,000? Did he have 40,000? Well, it's not a contradiction. It's again, somebody either added a zero or dropped a zero. It's a misprint, right? And I ask people, what do you do if you find errata in your errata? I don't know. But 2 Peter 1:21 locates the Spirit's work, okay, in the inspiration it provides the authors. So it's the moment of production of the text that's inspired. The originals, we're never guaranteed that people cannot either purposely abuse the text, add things that they want it to say. And this is one of the challenges we have with, say, the Bible the New World Translation that's used by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. It does things to the text that you shouldn't do to the text. They purposely add pieces in there in order to support their theology. Or it doesn't assume that things like the Wicked Bible wouldn't happen, where copyists, either ancient copyists or modern copyists, may get wrong. Okay, so all of those are what I classify as robot reporting. It is the idea that you think you have to have every piece of the Bible done in perfect order, or it fails. It's somehow contradictory. And again, that's not a contradiction. That's an error, and that's a completely different concept. Okay, so let's move on to number 2. What's the second type of error or type of problem text that people will point out? And this is a kind of something I call snubbing style to force meaning. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this is usually, snubbing style to force meaning is usually an abuse of the text itself, something that you're doing to the words where the words weren't meant to be taken as you're taking them. You're manipulating them in some way that's unfair. Okay? And let me give you some ideas on this. First of all, one of the biggest things that we see a lot of times is conformity to linguistic conventions and ignoring that idea. So what do I mean by that? Well, think of the Psalms, for example. You know, there are 6 things that God hates, 7 that he abhors. Well, which is it? Or there are 3 things, there are 4 that are a mystery to, which is it? Well, see, those aren't contradictions. It's not he says 3, he says 4, he can't make up his mind. That's not what's going on. In Hebrew, there is a pattern of reinforcement. If you really wanted to make a point of emphasis, you'd put them together. See, Hebrew poetry was different than English poetry. English poetry tends to rely a lot on meter and a lot on rhyme. So poetry in English, you would couple the same sounds at the end of words. That would make a rhyme. In Hebrew poetry, you would couple either ideas together. So they would either be the same idea, reinforced. There are 3, no 4. That puts a better emphasis on it, a bigger boom, so to speak. Or it would be ideas that this the Lord loves, but this the Lord hates. This the Lord loves, this the Lord. You would put an antithesis next to each other, and those kinds of ideas. So Hebrew poetry dealt with comparing and contrasting ideas rather than comparing and contrasting sounds, which, if you think about it, makes a whole lot of sense, because if you're writing something that's going to be translated into many different languages over many different years across many different cultures, comparing and contrasting ideas is the only thing that's going to stick, right? The sounds you can't guarantee. From language to language, the poetry would be lost, but the comparison of ideas, that makes sense. So stuff like that, to reiterate an idea, to say it bigger and bolder, is not the same thing as a contradiction. Or to use hyperbole, for example, is not an idea of contradiction. So when we read in the book of Joshua that Joshua wiped out all of the Canaanites, then we turn to the book of Judges, and the Judges says, but the Amorites and those guys, right? Judges chapter 1 starts talking about the guys that Joshua supposedly wiped out in Joshua's 10 through 20. You're like, well, wait a minute. I thought he said he wiped those out. Yeah, that kind of language was talking about a clear win. It reminds me much of sports guys who come in on Monday morning after watching the football game. Oh, man, did you see that game? We killed them. We slaughtered them. Oh, we dominated. Oh, yeah, what was the score? 8-6. Well, that's not really a kill. That's one field goal maybe is what you got lucky at, or something like that. But that kind of language does also show up because that's part of the language of the day. Just like I said, we use it. So we can't ignore the language styles that the original authors were living under, that they used, because that was just part of who they were. Secondly, ignoring non-literal forms of speech. Now, this is another way that happens all the time. What are non-literal forms of speech? Well, use of phenomenological language. Phenomenological language is language where you're trying to express an idea, a phenomena, and you use language that's familiar. So God's arm is not so short that he cannot save. But wait a minute. God is spirit, and those that worship him in spirit and in truth. Either he has arms and he's human, or he's spirit. Which is it? Well, that's called an anthropomorphism. That's right. That's picturing God as a man so that we can better grasp what we're trying to say. His eye is not seen, his ear is not heard. Hide me into the shelter of your wings, right? That's not an anthropomorphism. Maybe that's a poultrypomorphism. But we're using phenomenological language in order to convey an idea. They're not meant to be taken literally. Just like when we talk about the 4 corners of the earth, that doesn't imply either A, that the earth is somehow squared or cubed, or B, that the earth is flat. That's just using the language of phenomena to kind of better comprehend or better communicate an idea. It's not trying to make a case for something other than what you think. And guys who say, well, see, the earth is flat because they send one angel from each of the 4 corners of the earth. Okay, well, now we use that, right? The sun rises, the sun sets. Well, no, technically, if you're going to be accurate, the earth is rotating. The sun doesn't. It's not the sun that's moving. It's the earth that's rotating. Yeah, okay. But we don't talk like that. We don't say that to one another. We say at sunrise or at sunset. That's what we talk about. And so phenomenological language is replete throughout the Bible. And you've got to understand that and not consider that a contradiction. Also, metaphor. Metaphor is used all the time. So, for example, the beasts in the book of Daniel or the beasts in the book of Revelation, these are metaphors that are being used by the scriptures in order to show the vileness, the ravenousness, the animal-like nature of someone who wants to just consume for themselves. And that's a key aspect. So you can't take metaphors literally. It's abusing, it's snubbing the style. Metaphor is a linguistic style. It's a technique that you use, and you can't just ignore that and say you have to take it literally because it's the scripture. That doesn't make any sense. Scriptures can use metaphors. Scriptures can use phenomenological language and not be contradictory. And lastly, misunderstanding popular idioms. Now, this is another thing. It's a little bit different simply because what happens is, sometimes we don't know the idioms that are popular in another culture. Even our culture today, we have idioms that we use that we understand that others don't. I was reading a story about in World War II how an American command was talking to a British troop who was holding a line, and he said, "How is it down there?" And the Brits said, characters say, "Well, it's a bit sticky here, sir." Well, Americans hear that and they say, "Oh, you're having a little bit of difficulty. Okay, just, trudge on, hold the line." Well, British understatement, Brits would understand that as being, "No, I'm in desperate need. I'm going to need someone to help me out." And even there, we were talking about two languages at the same time. People just missed the idiom. Or I remember a friend telling me that I think he had a Russian cab driver and trying to get to an appointment. And he said, "Whew, boy, made it by the skin of our teeth." And the Russian turned to him and gave him a look like, "What are you talking about? Teeth don't have skin. How can, that doesn't make any sense at all." But again, these are idioms that we see over and over again. So Jesus' claim that he would be in the earth, right, in the tube 3 days. And people start pulling out, well, wait a minute, if he was crucified on Friday and then Saturday and Sunday, that's only 36 hours. That's not a full 72 hours. There's a contradiction. So no, 3 days and 3 nights is an idiom that the Jewish people used to say in any part of that day would be considered part of the day, the whole day, right? Let me give you an example. So there's we'll get to it. I'll have a specific example coming up, but any part of a Jewish day would mean, so it starts on Friday, it ends on Sunday. They consider that 3 sundowns, 3 days is the way that basically breaks out. It's just the way the idioms are used, and that's part of the issue. So those are the ideas of snubbing style to force meaning, ignoring conformity to the linguistic conventions, ignoring non-literal language like phenomenological language or metaphor, and misunderstanding popular idioms. Now, another way, the third way that we see people claim contradictions when they're not contradictions, is called my way or the highway. Now, what do I mean by this, my way or the highway? Well, this is not necessarily abusing the language itself, but it is abusing the broader context of the language. So it's ignoring the context in which the language is given. And let me give you some examples on this. So the first one would be strict chronological order of all events. And this is a kind of a little bit of a robot reporting idea, but really it's more used in as a contradiction because both aspects are reported, but they may be reported in different order. And for an ancient writer, that's just fine. As long as he's got them in there, he's good. So Matthew and Luke, when they both talk about the temptations of Jesus, right? There's the Jesus was hungry, turn these stones into bread. The devil tempts him. Okay. Then it was Jesus was taken to a high mountaintop and told him to throw himself down because God will protect you, Psalm 91. Or I will give you all of these kingdoms if you fall down and worship me, right? But Luke presents the last two in reverse order. So who's right, Matthew or Luke? Well, it's not a big deal. All three of them are still there. They've just been reshuffled because Luke wanted to make one point. He wanted to emphasize one thing. And Matthew wanted to emphasize another. And so they use those stories and reshuffle the order of them in order to show a different aspect for their audience of who Jesus is. Or they'll maybe put some of Jesus' teachings in a different place as he was going from town to town. That's very possible. That, they're just, again, trying to compile same ideas together. Jesus did teach all these things. But they're not trying to say, at time A, then time B, then time C, then time D. They're just trying to say these are the kinds of things that Jesus taught. And to desire that to be in a strict order wasn't necessary for them at the time. Another thing that folks will try to push is difference, misunderstanding or ignoring difference in emphasis or perspective. And this is pretty key. So Genesis chapter 1 versus Genesis chapter 2 is a key aspect where Genesis chapter 1 gets through an overview of the creation event from a 30,000 foot view. And then Genesis chapter 2 kind of zooms in on the last day of creation and gives some more explicit detail on what's going on there. And the idea, again, is there's an emphasis put on man now that man exists. They want to focus on that aspect and not necessarily everything else that's going on. So many times you'll see this idea where Kings and Chronicles, they tell the same stories. Chronicles has much more of a religious emphasis on how Israel and Judah, the split kingdoms, were sliding away from God religiously, whereas Kings, of course, has an emphasis on the leadership and the kings themselves and how they were also failing God as the leaders of the Jewish people. So you see these difference in perspective. They're not telling different tales, they're telling the same stories in different ways. A third thing, and this happens all the time, is applying modern definitions to ancient texts. See, we have to remember that the Bible is a text that was written over a course of 1,500 years, and it was completed even then, 2,000 years ago. When we try to take modern 21st century definitions of things and imprint it on something that's 3,000 years old, 2,000 years old, it's no surprise we're going to find that they don't fit well. Those categories hadn't even been invented yet. So I say, it's a popular ruse. I get one of the first things that I dealt with when I was launching my ministry was a person who wrote in who said that the Bible contains an error because it talks about the hare chewing cud, that the rabbit chews cud. And the rabbit doesn't chew cud. The cow chews cud. Cud chewing animals are animals that have a second stomach that can regurgitate it and chew it over again in order to get the extra nutrients out. And that's not what the rabbit does. Okay, fine, So I wrote back. I said, yes, the rabbit performs a thing called cecotrophy. What does that mean? That means that he eats the grass passes through his digestive system. He basically poops it out the other end, picks it up, and starts re-eating it again for a second shot at the nutrients. So is that chewing cud? Well, not in our 21st century classification, no. Is that redigesting food that you've digested once? Yeah. Is that really a contradiction? No. Again, it's using a very rigid 21st century definition of chewing cud and trying to apply it to something 2,000 years ago. It's not that the newer meanings define the terms, right? Bat versus bird. Hey, bats are classified as birds in the Bible. The Bible doesn't know anything. Okay, well, when did those classifications come out? Linnaeus's taxonomies didn't come out until the 18th century? It's like, and you're trying to apply that back to something that was written in, 1000 BC? Give me a break. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's a side of, this is why I call this my way or the highway. You're trying to force your view on an ancient text when it has no business being there. The last one that you see a lot of times is inerrancy of all opinions held by biblical writers, but not in Scripture. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by that is that the Bible talks or quotes a lot of individuals, and not all the quotes that the individuals themselves say are true. So we can't take every quotation and apply it as a scriptural mandate from God. Job's friends, right? Job's friends talk a lot about sin and how God wouldn't allow evil to happen to other people. And when God shows up in chapter 38 and all, he rebukes them. He said, you're all wrong. You guys don't get it. No, Job was the most righteous man on earth at that time. A more recent example, John 21, verses 20 through 23. The scriptures read, Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back on his bosom, and said, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? So Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Now, that's interesting. And that story went around, John tells us. He says, therefore the saying went out among the brethren that the disciple would not die. But John quickly corrects his readers. He goes, and yet Jesus did not say he would not die. Only, what if I want him to remain till I come? What is that to you? So you see this idea of you can't just take every quote and say, oh, Jesus said he'll never die. No, he didn't say it that. He said, what do you care? You know, how does that affect your life? That shouldn't affect you. Let me worry about him. You worry about you. Or anytime that, Judas makes a claim or something like that, just because people say things in the Bible doesn't mean that God endorses what they say. It may be what they say is true. The Bible is accurately capturing what they say, but it doesn't mean that what they say is true. So what I want to do next is to go through some examples of supposed contradictions in the time we have left and highlight how these work. And hopefully that'll give you enough practice on these in order to help you if you face them in the future. And again, if you want to comment on any of these things, you can comment by tweeting us with the hashtag #ComeReason. You can go on the YouTube channel if you're watching and go on the chat button right there, and we will read your comments on YouTube chat. Leave comments underneath the video. Ask questions. You can text in their comments any way you want to go. We'll be able to take those kinds of things. We do have all of these set up. You can text your questions to this number, 951-732-8631. You can, like I said, use the YouTube chat, and I'll see those coming in there as well. So let's get started with some examples of contradictions in the Bible. Well, here's a popular one, Jesus sayings on the cross. Now, if we look at this, I'm going to zoom in here so that you can see it. What do we have? We have Matthew 27, 46 and 50, where Jesus says, right? Here they all come. Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? When he cried again with a loud voice and yielded up his ghost. Luke says Jesus' last words were, and when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. John 19:30, when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. So which is it? Is it, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Is it, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit? Or is it is finished? Are these contradictions? The three gospel writers can't even seem to get Jesus' last words right? Or is that? Now let's slow down and take a look at these kinds of things. Matthew says Jesus cried with a loud voice, and he cried again. So he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then he said something else. He may have said 3 or 4 things in between. Remember, I said expecting robot reporting. And that's, people like Matthew can leave things out. But he did cry again at the end. So whatever he cried again were his last words, not the, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? John said when Jesus had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost. Now, if John is saying giving up the ghost is the last thing, it is finished. Is it is finished the last words? Or does he give up the ghost by saying something else? Is that action that John identifies as giving up the ghost maybe words? Luke seems to imply that when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. So we don't know exactly, but it would strike me that he said, it is finished. And then, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And that last phrase is the act John was pointing to in giving up the ghost. Both of those things together being the cry that Matthew points to when he yielded up his ghost in Matthew 27. So it's not necessarily a contradiction. And again, we don't have to prove that we know exactly what the order is. The goal in all of this is to say, you're claiming it's a contradiction. Whoever makes the claim must show that it has to be a contradiction. And in this example, it obviously isn't contradictory. So that's one example. Let's take another look at another example. Problems with animals. Yes, this is always a key, something that I get skeptics with all the time. So for example, Psalm 58:8, right? Let them be like the snail that dissolves into the sun. I actually had a guy write me and say the Bible doesn't know what it's talking about. It's written by men. Because Psalm 58 says the snail dissolves into the slime as he goes along, and of course we know that that's not true. Okay, this is what error is this? This is snubbing style to force meaning. This is the use of a metaphor. The snail dissolves into slime. I mean, it's poetic language. The Psalms are poetry. They're meant to be poetry. This is a very poetic phrase that the writer is using to evoke a feeling. Of course, they were smart enough to look at snails and say, hey, they're not going away day after day. They knew that they didn't dissolve. It's just a poet. Snakes in Genesis 3, that's not the serpent of old, the demon. Again, that's a metaphor. That's a use of things like beast. It's something that people would recognize. We even use that today. That lawyer was a real snake. I mean, we use this kind of terminology all the time. To think that the gospel writers or the Old Testament writers couldn't use it is serious, silly. Other uses. Job 39:9 in the King James. Will the unicorn be willing to serve thee? Well, this is actually a mistranslation. So this kind of goes back to the robot reporting error. It's probably talking about a one-horned or an ancient predecessor of the cow, but wild bulls, we're not quite sure, but they were mistranslated in the King James. They were from the text that the translators were using into unicorn, and that's not what the original text says. So there's no unicorns claimed in the Bible. Lastly, the bat is not a bird. Yes, and we talked about that. Carl Linnaeus's taxonomic classifications really don't fit when you're talking about the Bible. But again, he was making those things up in the 18th century. And if you're talking about winged creatures that fly, as opposed to classifying things as warm-blooded, cold-blooded, eggs, live births, if you just want to keep it simple and talk about flying things and not flying things, then you're going to include bats with birds, or creeping things and non-creeping things, right? So a spider is going to be grouped in with the insects. Those kinds of items that happen all the time. So I don't have those things bother me. They're definitely not contradictions. Let's see. The Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain is another piece that we see a lot of times. Which one is it? Where did Jesus actually give this thing? Well, is it? There's a couple of situations that you're talking about this. Is it possible that there was a flat spot on top of the mount that Jesus sat down and gave so that the crowds could hear him? That's a possibility. Is it possible that Jesus maybe, like any good itinerant preacher, gave his message more than once because it was so important that people in different areas could see it? I mean, it's not like you could, listen to the podcast because he gave it one time. He would go around and probably he would reinforce that message in different areas, especially if it was significant. The Sermon on the Mount, pretty significant message. So when Luke has it on the plain, I don't see a problem with that at all. Other problems with numbers, I mentioned the 4,000 versus 40,000. Many times you see those kinds of things. Again, that's an example of robot reporting that you find all the time. Here's a good one, Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2, right? And a guy writes, I'm having a really hard time trying to figure out which story of creation of man is true. Is it the one in Genesis chapter 1 or the one in Genesis chapter 2? So, of course, you understand Genesis chapter 1. God gives the 6 days of creation, and he outlines that man is basically the last thing that's created. The trees, the fish, the birds, the animals, and man is kind of the end cap. The ultimate achievement, so to speak, in Genesis 1. But then you go to Genesis 2, and in Genesis 2, after God creates man out of the dust of the ground, then he says he plants a garden in Eden. Well, I thought the plants were created before Adam. What is this? And then God makes all these animals and brings them over to Adam to name and stuff like that. So how do we understand Genesis chapter 1 versus Genesis chapter 2? Well, I like to look at it like a movie this is a technique many in Hollywood use, where Genesis chapter 1 kind of gives you a broad overview of the 6 days of creation, right? And then Genesis chapter 2 says, well, let's go back and see. So, this is John, this is Mary. John grew up as a simple kid. Mary grew up in the big city. Yet they met and fell in love. Let's go back and see how John and Mary met. And then the rest of the hour 37 for the movie zooms in on John and Mary's relationship starting from before they knew one another. Well, this is what I think Genesis chapter 2 is doing. It talks about from the creation of Adam. And it doesn't say that God created all the plants and all the animals after the creation of Adam. It says he planted a garden in Eden. So he created a specific place that on the earth that already existed. Okay. Special spot for Adam called Eden. We know that Adam can get kicked out of Eden, so Eden is not the whole world. It's something different. And there was an angel sent to guard the way to Eden, so there seems to be some egress and ingress to that place. And it also says that God brought all the animals by for Adam to name, but that doesn't mean that all of the animals didn't exist prior to it. It's just a zoom in. It's a focus. Matter of fact, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it says, this is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God created them. It gives you a full summation, even at a broader scope. So that's the idea there. I don't think that this is a contradiction. I think this is a detail of Genesis chapter 2 that was spoke of an overview in Genesis chapter 1. So, okay, here's the last one that we'll tackle. Who tempted David to sin? And this is one that's very popular, that comes up all the time. And I do have an article on my website on it if you ever want to dig into this in more detail. So 2 Samuel 24 reads as follows. This is when David decided to number the people of Israel in order to do a census, see how strong he was, which was considered sin. God is to fight for Israel. David didn't have to number the army. He did so anyway. And God said, and the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he had cited David against them, saying, go and take a census of Israel and Judah. But in talking about the same event, 1 Chronicles 21, Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. Well, wait a minute. Who was it? Was it the Lord or was it Satan? Well, both can be true. Remember, I told you at the beginning that a contradiction means something at the same time and in the same manner. This is a difference of in the same manner. So while the Lord, maybe in his anger, burned against Israel, his inciting David was an allowance. He allowed David to sin against him by allowing Satan access to David. It's very much like the explicit understanding in Job chapter 1, right? Where Job rebels Satan accuses God and says, I can't tempt Job. Job will deny you to your face if you just let me tempt him. And God says, okay, you can have, all he has is in your hand, you just can't touch his body. And then later, the second time, he says, okay, you just can't take his life, right? So God allows Satan to do certain things. This is called providence. It was an old-fashioned term called providence. That all things are managed by God. This is very much a Hebrew understanding of the way the world works. God's providential allowance of events to unfold include allowing Satan to rise up and tempt David so that God's ultimate purposes can be fulfilled. In the same way that God allowed Satan to inflict Job and tempt Job so that God could teach Job something about himself. So, again, is this a contradiction? No, it's not a flat contradiction. Okay, moving on one more time. The resurrection accounts. Again, if you read the accounts, and I don't have time to read all of them in depth, but if you read them, you'll see that the number of women at the tomb seems to always be changing. And this is one of those things where, again, scholar says, nobody can even agree how many women were at the tomb, right? John 20 says, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark. In Matthew 28, though, it says, now after the Sabbath, as it began at dawn, toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to the look for the grave. But Mark 16 says there were at least 3 women, right? Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices. Luke, of course, is the kicker. Now, he writes, there were Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and also other women, plural. So he lists 3 and says there's at least, plural, 2 more. There's got to be at least 5. Who knows? Bunch of women. Well, which is it? Well, again, this isn't a contradiction. This is leaving out details that weren't necessary to some of the authors. And we do this again all the time. I use this example. If I say go into the office, say I took the family and we watched a movie on Friday night, spent our weekend that way, and come into the office. And the receptionist says, hi, how are you? I said, good. Oh, did you have a good weekend? Yeah, I got to see that new movie. It was pretty interesting. Oh, okay. And then I sit down with my coworkers, who we've known each other for a while. And he says, hey, what'd you and the wife do? Oh, I took the wife to go see that new film. That was pretty fun. Okay, great. And then my mom calls and I'll say, no, I was with the kids and I and the wife all went out and watched that movie on Friday night. Have I contradicted myself? No. I'm not going to tell the receptionist about my family. She's not necessarily all that interested. I may not know her that well. My coworker knows my wife, so he's interested in what we did, as opposed to, we do these kinds of shortcuts all the time. We focus on those aspects of our conversation that are important, and we leave out the other details. But it's not a contradiction. It's just giving you the information that is important for you to know. Okay, one more concept, and then we'll set ourselves down to close up and take any questions that you may have. How do we deal with these kind of charges when we get them? Well, here's the point. Number 1, find out, is it really a contradiction? See, the burden of proof rests on the critics. There is good evidence to believe the Bible is from God, and if there's a possible solution, then it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's up to the person who's objecting, who's saying that it is contradictory, to prove that. You don't have to carry the burden of proof there. The burden of proof rests on the critic to find out whether it's really a contradiction. But be sure you know what the text says. Be sure you look back at it. Things like that 2 Samuel passage are key. And be sure you know what the text means. Don't confuse error with imprecision. It's important. But secondly, and this is probably more important in these discussions, find out if they will really accept an answer. Because you don't want to be wasting your time talking to people who's just going to ignore anything you say anyway. It's not worth your while. So Julia Sweeney, who is ex-Saturday Night Live, she's a comedian, she took a very negative view toward Bible. The Bible itself is an archaeological document, and it should be treated like archaeological documents as trustworthy. If other documents call into question the Bible text, why should we assume that the Bible is in error and not those other documents? But Julia Sweeney, she took a different tact. So here's what she said, and I'm going to quote from her. To me, she says, the Iliad offers more insight into human character and lessons than the Bible. Like Jesus was angry a lot when he turned all those people into pigs and made them run off a mountain. It was so hateful, not just to people, but to the pigs. I felt upset for the pigs, she says. Now, Sweeney is trying to object to the story in Mark 5. However, a woeful misunderstanding shows she hasn't even done the thoughtful reading of the text itself. It's not that Jesus turned people into pigs. He's cast demons out of people and cast the demons into a herd of swine. But that's okay. Sweeney's not bothered by the fact that she doesn't know the text she's criticizing. She goes on. She says, yes, I know the passages I cite have all kinds of theories and complicated layers of meaning. No, you just have to read them. She goes, I know the theories. I know the way people explain those passages. Obviously not. I looked into it, but now it doesn't really matter because when I, after a long learning curve, really understood how the Bible was put together, which stories were kept and which weren't, what political situations were in place and what was useful to emphasize and so forth, then the Bible became a really interesting historical religious document to me. Inspiring but not sacred. Very much the work of ancient man and not the inspired word of God. So you see, telling me all about the meanings behind those stories is sort of beside the point at this point. Yeah, I have to agree with her there. I think she's right. That's the whole problem, is she's not going to be interested at all in listening to what anyone has to say. She's made up her mind. She hasn't checked anything out. She just completely, mangled the text, and that was a huge deal. But she thinks that she's, got it all locked down. So you can always ask a question at another point in time. Write us in any one of these channels. We'll get in touch with you. Make sure that happens. And what's exciting is next week we're going to be tackling the next question in our Christianity in the Hot Seat series. Does God promote slavery, genocide, and sexism? Is our Bible woefully out of date? Does the Bible, endorse these kind of atrocities toward humanity? I think it should be a pretty relevant discussion, so I'm looking forward to it. And until then, I hope that you guys all have a wonderful, wonderful time. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.